Yeah, as is often the case, the answers in Genesis answer to this particular question is garbage here. It's completely false. The issue at hand that we're talking about is the contradiction between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 in terms of the order of creation. In Genesis chapter 1, we have vegetation created before animals and animals created before any human beings at all. But in Genesis chapter 2, we have Adam created before any vegetation or animals, and then Eve created last in a sequence after all of this. Now, Answers in Genesis tries to get around some of these contradictions, at least the most obvious of these contradictions, by endorsing an illegitimate translation of Genesis chapter 2, verse 19. They endorse a pluperfect translation of this particular verse and would have it say something like, now God had formed out of the dust of the ground all these animals, had formed, as in had a long time ago formed these animals. So to try to say that although the preceding verses have been talking about the creation of Adam, God had already made the animals some time ago at a previous time period, and thereby attempts to reconcile the two different narrative sequences between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 in terms of the order of creation, at least with respect to animals and human beings. There's a number of problems with this. First of all, in the immediately preceding verse in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, God says, I will make, in the imperfect aspect, usually translated in the future tense, I will make a suitable helper for Adam, then proceeds to go about making these animals, which are then brought to Adam to see if they are the suitable helper that God set out to achieve. And it's only after God sort of discovers that these aren't suitable helpers that God then goes on to make Eve. So the text has a pretty clear narrative sequence in terms of how the events follow one after the other. And given that in verse 18, that imperfect verb there is I will make, this implies something that has not already been done. That's the entire function of an imperfect verb. This is an action that has not been completed yet. And so if this is a reference to the creation of animals, or at least the attempt to create a suitable helper in the form of animals in the verse that follows it, verse 19, then this doesn't actually fix any contradiction at all. It introduces a new contradiction now between the aspects of these two verbs. But perhaps a bigger problem with trying to translate the verb at the beginning of Genesis chapter 2, verse 19 into the pluperfect tense is the simple fact that biblical Hebrew does not have tenses in general or the pluperfect tense in particular. The form of this verb is called the vayikol form, or the vav consecutive with imperfect form, and it's a very common form of the verb, especially at the beginning of what are otherwise sentences in long-form biblical Hebrew narration, and it usually has the sense of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and you see it used a lot to that general effect. And as a result, it's deeply connected to the idea of narrative sequence, and then this happened, and then this happened, etc., etc. Now, there are a handful of rare but legitimate occasions in which we could translate the vayikol form into something that vaguely approximates the pluperfect in English, and there is a scholar named C. John Collins, not the John Collins of Introduction to the Hebrew Bible fame, a different John Collins of a more evangelical stripe, who has written an article laying out the different conditions in which we could legitimately do this. And after surveying a number of Hebrew grammars, he comes up with 3 situations in which it is legitimate to translate it with something like a pluperfect tense. Number 1, the verb appears in the vayikol form at the very beginning of a new section of the narrative. Well, that clearly does not apply here. Number 2, the vayikol verb explicitly refers back to the same vayikol verb in an immediately preceding verse. That's not the case here in Genesis chapter 2 either. And number 3, we can legitimately translate this verbal form into the pluperfect tense if the narrative logic of the passage absolutely requires it. That is to say, if the story makes absolutely no sense unless we translate it into something like this pluperfect tense. And this is the option that C. John Collins opts for. Unfortunately, his argument for this is pretty terrible. He insists that the author or final editor, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, simply would not put 2 contradictory chapters back to back. And as a result, these 2 passages must not contradict. And as a result, we must translate Genesis chapter 2, verse 19 into the pluperfect tense in order to reconcile what would otherwise be a pretty serious contradiction between these 2 chapters and the narrative sequence that they present. But the book of Genesis is chock full of contradictions that an author or editor has allowed to continue to exist in the story. Just a couple chapters after the creation story, we get to our 2 flood accounts, which contradict each other on a number of points. The length of the flood, where the flood waters come from, the kinds of animals that Noah is supposed to bring in the ark. Here, the contradictions are back to back, verse by verse, and the editing there is even more abrupt and haphazard than it is just having them back to back in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. So essentially, C. John Collins' argument boils down to an a priori commitment to the idea that there can't be contradictions of this kind in the Bible. At this point, the argument isn't really about grammar or translation at all, but really just about C. John Collins' preferred presuppositions. So in conclusion, the verb at the beginning of Genesis chapter 2, verse 19 cannot be legitimately translated into the pluperfect tense. Answers in Genesis answer to this contradiction is incorrect, and the contradiction between the narrative sequence in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 remains.